welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. This week marked 1 month since Donald Trump got both Hamas and Israel to agree to a 20-point peace plan for Gaza. Phase 1 was supposed to cease the fighting, see the exchange of hostages, flood the strip with aid, and begin the process of Israel withdrawing its troops from Gaza. By all accounts, it is not going so well. While the exchanges of live and dead hostages continues, the aid is not getting into the war and famine-plagued population, which is now suffering from conditions not heard of since the turn of the last century, like scabies and scurvy, as tons of uncollected refuge piles up and any drinking water is contaminated. Meanwhile, according to Al-Jazeera, citing Gaza ministry sources, the Israeli government has violated the ceasefire 280 times as of November 11th. The Gaza office said Israel shot at civilians 88 times, raided residential areas beyond the yellow line 12 times, bombed Gaza 124 times, and demolished people's properties on 52 occasions. It added that Israel has also detained 23 Palestinians from Gaza over the last month. Israel still occupies around 58% of the strip and is hardening its presence beyond that yellow line with what looks like permanent structures. Israel-backed militias continue to skirmish with Hamas, which by all accounts is negotiating for the second phase, but is not willing to disarm or give up its governance yet. This puts the progress of the agreement at a virtual standstill, since Israel has insisted that Hamas disarm before it leaves the territory. Americans, meanwhile, have been standing up a civil-military coordination center to help oversee international humanitarian and security assistance into Gaza and to monitor the ceasefire agreement. Details are scarce. Israeli media has reported that the Israelis are being sidelined, but there are also reports that air nations in the region will not participate in an international security force because the conditions are too chaotic and violent in the strip today. There have also been rumors that the United States is building a base at the center and housing American troops there, a story that was quickly denied by the Pentagon. If Washington was sidelining or pressuring Israel, it has yet to have an effect. And time is of the essence as more and more Palestinians are at risk of dying, not just by direct Israeli attacks, but by unsafe buildings that are at risk of collapse, disease, lack of food, medicine, or proper health care. More than 69,000 Palestinians have died in the war that we know of, and this number is likely to be much, much higher and growing every day. So here to talk about the deal, its failures, and what might be next are my two Quincy Institute colleagues, Anel Sheline and Khalid Al-Gindi. Khalid had just joined the Quincy Institute very recently, and we're so glad to have him. Anel is a research fellow in the Middle East program, and Khalid is a senior fellow as well in the program and an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. So thank you both for joining me today. I so very appreciate you being with me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Great to be here, Kelly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we don't have a lot of time, and I realize that I set the table for a very broad discussion. But I guess I'd just like to hear from both of you. What are your thoughts 1 month after the signing of this historic agreement in which Trump had been called, the ultimate peace president? I mean, he was feted with so many encomiums coming from the Israelis when he spoke and was welcomed at the Knesset a month ago. Can you talk a little bit about how you're feeling about that ceasefire agreement today? I'll start with you, Anel.
Well, Kelly, it's as you said, things are not going well, is putting it mildly. And I think really the major concern here is that without sufficient pressure from the United States, we're likely to see a repeat of the January ceasefire that Israel violated with impunity, and then starting on March 2nd, blocked all aid, and then by March 18th, abandoned any pretense of a ceasefire. And under those circumstances, we didn't see the Trump administration pushing back at all. And a generous reading of that might say Trump had just re-entered the White House. There was a lot going on. This issue simply was, not at the forefront of his agenda, but there's always a lot going on in any White House, and especially in a Trump White House. And given that, as you said, Trump really did seemed to portray this as such a groundbreaking, transformative peace deal. I mean, I do think a big part of the rushed nature of that had to do with Trump's hope that he might procure a Nobel Peace Prize as a result. Now that that's no longer on the table, at least for this year, he's lost interest. But it is certainly... this is something that we as a team at Quincy have talked about, the fact that, yes, it is preferable for there to be fewer deaths than what we saw previously, to see some aid getting in contrast to the period where there was zero aid, or it was only the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was really largely responsible for killing people and the deaths of people in its proximity. So yes, it is preferable to the all-out Holocaust that existed prior to a month ago. But I think the concern is Israel is not abiding by the terms. It is not allowing inadequate aid. Winter is coming. And as you said, the sort of hardening of Israel's occupation of the portion of Gaza, largely to the east, the eastern portion, relegating the inhabitants, the Palestinians in Gaza, to the western portion closer to the sea, which is also historically the less fertile area. I mean, it's everything in Gaza is so destroyed. I mean, any sort of agricultural land has really been fully destroyed. But the hope would be, moving forward, that perhaps it would be possible for Palestinians to reestablish some form of farming or agriculture at some point down the line, but not if they don't have access to the land where that would be possible. The one thing that I think is worth drawing some attention to is this idea, let me find the exact word, the alternate safe communities is now what we're hearing. The idea that Palestinians that would be in, I think the idea is that the initial pilot project would be in Rafah, but especially the idea that this part of Gaza that Israel controls, they would allow Palestinians to move into that. And the idea would be to sort of separate them from Hamas, which is something that Israel has long wanted to do, which, again, I mean, aside from the fact that this would violate just basic principles of freedom of movement, that Israel needs to just relinquish control of Gaza. But also just it's not going to work. We saw things like this, like during the Vietnam War, for example, where the US military sort of tried to separate Vietnamese civilians from the Viet Cong. And it's the takeaway is, this is a population that is resisting its own annihilation and the ongoing occupation. So even if there were a way to sort of like separate out individuals with a connection to Hamas, which itself is fairly ludicrous because Hamas has been in charge for such a long time. Hamas runs Gaza. It's the government. And so you can have someone with an affiliation to Hamas that is, again, just the entire premise is
an impossibility.
Right. It's an impossibility. And again, it's sort of like, even if somehow, let's say Hamas lays down its weapons, you're going to have another group that emerges to continue to resist occupation and annihilation. So it doesn't, it's only a matter of time that, whatever these Palestinians that were certified, acceptable to move into these new communities and receive life-sustaining aid, they are also going to resist these circumstances. I mean, it's the entire premise is ludicrous. But at the moment, this is what we're seeing coming out of the Trump State Department and White House, and this is what the Israelis want, and the Trump administration has been willing to do everything the Israelis want.
So, Khalid, I mean, Anel pointed out, okay, the ceasefire was put into place, and a lot of people saw this as a much better alternative than the daily slaughter that we saw. But it sounds to me like a lot of the failures that we're seeing now are kind of baked in to the plan itself. Can you talk a little bit about, well, I of course want to hear what you have to say a month after, but did you see this coming down Broadway, in other words, in terms of what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I'm not terribly surprised by the state of affairs in Gaza. I mean, we've seen how the ceasefire in Lebanon has played out, where Israel has been allowed to continue bombing there with the permission of both the previous Biden administration and the current Trump administration. When we've seen other kind of similar precedents in the past, ceasefire means the other side ceases and Israel gets to continue firing at its own discretion. Of course, it is at a much diminished scale. I mean, there was, it is not at the catastrophic, horrific scale of 100, 200 people a day that we saw most of the last 2 years. But there are daily killings, and there is daily destruction, and there are mortars, and there are airstrikes, as we heard in your introduction. So it's not terribly surprising, but it is disturbing. One thing I want to say about the plan, because the president, of course, has a tendency to overhype both his role, but also the plan itself. He talks about ending 3,000 years of conflict, and there is no such thing as 3,000 years of conflict in Palestine or Israel, and in fact there is not a peace plan as such. This does not end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by any stretch. I think the most generous description we could give it would be it is a ceasefire and arrangement to help stabilize Gaza after horrific violence. But a peace plan, it is not. It does not even mention the West Bank. It talks about Palestinian statehood as a Palestinian aspiration and not something that is inherently their right, the right to self-determination. So it is far from a peace plan. But to the extent that it is designed to be a ceasefire, it is only minimally that. As Anel, I think, painted a very good picture of the reality, is that Israel has not ceased most of its, even though the agreement itself, I mean, the text of the agreement says that it calls for a suspension of all airstrikes, bombardment, mortar attacks, and so forth. And of course, that is not what Israel is doing. So even in terms of the letter of yes, the agreement is problematic, but even in terms of the text of the deal, Israel is not meeting its obligations. Sorry.
No, keep going.
Yeah. And the part of the problem here, it's not a small part, it's maybe the major part of the problem. We saw in the first ceasefire deal in January, the president took credit, President Trump took credit for bringing that deal about. In reality, it was kind of a joint effort between the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. But he did make it clear that he wanted to see this war ended. And then he did that. The problem is the president has a very short attention span. And so he allowed, despite taking credit for this deal, he told the Israelis quite explicitly earlier this year that if you want to go ahead and resume the war, you can. And so he openly greenlit Israel's ability to violate that ceasefire. Since then, since March of last year, another 20,000 Palestinians have been killed. So just imagine the human toll. I mean, of course, it's all horrendous, but if the president really wanted to, cast himself as the ultimate peacemaker, that would have been the moment to do it by keeping Israel to the original ceasefire earlier this year. But he did not. And so, as Anel pointed out, a lot of people are looking at this current situation and saying, maybe he'll just lose interest and get bored, or allow Netanyahu to get into his ear like he did before, and all of this will come crashing down. But even if he doesn't, it's still something less than what the ceasefire was intended to do. And what we have is a situation of a de facto partition of Gaza between 2 million people crammed into less than half of Gaza's territory. Gaza was already
crammed.
Was already one of the most densely populated places on earth, and now it's even more densely populated, but without the infrastructure, because so much of Gaza has been destroyed, without hospitals, without schools, without roads, without water treatment plants, without agricultural land, without access to even land borders. It's quite a dystopian reality, and another 200,000 or so Palestinians in the Israeli-controlled part of Gaza that is being systematically erased. Israel has destroyed something like 1,500 buildings since the ceasefire was put in place a month ago, and so we're seeing essentially a reduction of what Gaza is. There is no prospect. The plan itself does not call for a timetable for an Israeli withdrawal. The terms of Israel's withdrawal are basically left to Israel's discretion, pending all of these other developments, like a reformed Palestinian Authority and, of course, the disarming of Hamas. These are things that may not actually be achievable. I mean, it will be, how do you disarm a group that is the only thing between, Israeli leaders have not been shy about expressing their hopes for depopulating Gaza and destroying it and pushing out the population. And so now if people are going to set out to disarm the one group that is standing between survival and total expulsion or annihilation, it's going to be a very hard sell, because, as Anel said, even if Hamas were disarmed, others will find ways to arm themselves, just given the fact that Israel's there, it's continuing to kill and destroy and starve people, and so it doesn't address the core problems.
Let me ask you a question about the yellow line and the future. We talked a little bit about this off camera. Do you see a situation, I'm kind of hearing it from both of you, where Israel will just keep that 58%, dictate who can come in and out of it? What happens, and if that's the case, what happens to the rest of Gaza? Is it like a situation like Escape to New York, the old John Carpenter movie, where you have this dystopian, lawless place that is maybe secured from afar by drones and surveillance, and then the rest of it, the 58%, is reconstructive, and the people who are allowed to go there can go there? I mean, what do you see and what do you hear from Israeli leaders that might lead you to believe that there is a longer view or vision here that might not line up to what Trump had in mind when he set up this plan? I don't know. Anel, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Excuse me. No, I mean, I'm certainly, I think that is what a lot of people are assuming that seems like what is perhaps happening. And Khalid said yesterday in our meeting, he wouldn't be surprised to see settlements starting to be established in that part of Gaza that Israel controls. At the same time, there is still this fundamental incompatibility with what Israel wants and what the U.S. says it wants. I mean, again, even though these alternate safe communities are extremely dystopian, it would still mean a place for Palestinians in this part of Gaza. I mean, an extremely restricted, there's been information coming out about just, the increasing use of Palestinians' biometric data. There's just the sort of the extreme control that Israel has been increasingly using the Palestinian population to experiment with developing the technology necessary for fully controlling an entire population that it then sells to authoritarian countries around the region and the world, and also to our country, which should alarm all of us. But again, there, the sort of what appears to be emerging as the Trump administration's vision isn't Israeli settlers per se. It would still be this sort of sanitized place for Palestinians where they would ostensibly be separated from Hamas and disarmed and fully disempowered, but allowed to live. In contrast to, no, this simply becomes a part of Israel where settlers are allowed to live. I mean, I guess maybe the way the U.S. and Israeli governments would square that would be something like a West Bank type scenario where you have settlers protected by the IDF living in close proximity to these sort of little fenced in hamlets where Palestinians movement is restricted. And I mean, again, it's none of this is a recipe for
success,
stability, right? Security for anyone. Also not Israelis. I mean, this is, I think I in particular am tired of having to put the argument in, what effect does this have on Israelis? But for those who claim to be motivated by those kinds of questions about Israeli security, and this is especially relevant right now in Washington as Israel is seeking to renegotiate a new MOU, and in particular hoping to get a 20-year MOU, memorandum of understanding for a security commitment from the United States. I think knowing that their previous 10-year commitments that they've gotten 3 already, hoping to get a 20-year one because they know that U.S. support is splintering, including especially among the America First crowd, certainly on the left. So I think it makes sense that they're trying to lock in a 20-year commitment because they may think that 10 years from now, they're not likely to get another one. And certainly 20 years from now, they're even perhaps that much less likely to get another one. So they're just trying to lock in what they can for now.
And just to be clear, that's some $4 billion a year.
Exactly. Right. And reporting seems to indicate that obviously Israel would like that to be even a little higher, although that may be a tough sell in Trump's Washington. But so just the ways, and this is something that I think would be useful if we have time for Khalid to get into more, just sort of the fundamental flaws with the 20-point plan. I mean, it is no Palestinians were involved in its creation. No Palestinians likewise were involved in this idea of these like ASC, alternate safe communities. I mean, in general, Palestinians have historically been completely removed and given no opportunity to have agency in their own, the the removal of self-determination is so all-encompassing. Palestinians are not even allowed to sort of narrate their own stories or participate in their own governance. So, more on that if we have time to get into it. But certainly, I would not be surprised, Kelly, to get back to your question, if the yellow line does become sort of a permanent feature, and again, but permanent, viewed as a permanent feature. But again, this is not sustainable. This is not
Right.
a long-term recipe.
It's
for
a
anything
recipe
other
for
than more
another
violence.
war, 5, 10, 20 years down the road. Khaled, I want you to answer the original question about the yellow line and the hardening, but also, do you get any sense that the Trump administration might be feeling a little differently about this ceasefire than they did in January, maybe taking a little more ownership for it? I say that because of this coordination center, the fact that they've sent some troops there, that they are trying to get the Arab nations on board with a peacekeeping force or whatever they're calling it, that there has been reports about them taking Israel off the leadership role of the humanitarian aid flows. There is some sense of frustration that the Israelis aren't upholding their end, though they don't say it. But there does seem to be more at stake here because Trump made it his plan.
Yeah. I think that's right. But just going for a moment to the original question about the yellow line and the partition of Gaza, what Israeli officials are saying pretty clearly is their intention is in that 42% of Gaza where the bulk of the 2 million people live, and where Hamas is ostensibly still in control of at least, in some capacity as a governing force, that their goal is to squeeze that part of Gaza, to squeeze Hamas by depriving it of humanitarian assistance and also reconstruction. There will be they say quite clearly, there will be no reconstruction in that part of Gaza. And the U.S. officials have basically adopted this same stance. So, in other words, what Israel is doing is precisely the same policy that was in place and that led to October 7th. The notion that you can squeeze an entire population, collective punishment in order to force them somehow to overthrow their leaders, and by denying them the ability to live normal lives, that clearly didn't work for 17 years and backfired quite literally. It blew up in Israel's face on October 7th. And yet the lesson learned is, well, if it didn't work the first time, we have to do more of it instead of rethink the whole approach. And that's the fundamental problem here. And of course, the conditions are far worse than they were over the 17 years, because as we discussed, everything's been destroyed. So as Anel has pointed out, I mean, this is completely untenable. It is not going to take 5 years for it to explode again. It will be a constant source of instability and violence. We're just going to see this kind of recurring Groundhog Day kind of violence over and over, and that itself will become the pretext. I mean, if we're looking in our crystal balls, I can completely imagine how, well, now there's these armed insurgents, whether they're Hamas or anyone else, who are firing at Israeli soldiers, who are, whatever they're doing, and that becomes the pretext to maintain that situation indefinitely, exactly the way Israel's blockade was enforced indefinitely for 17 years. So it will blow up. It's just a matter of when and how large that explosion is going to be. And this is where I think the Trump administration is really lacking. They lack the expertise on the issue. They don't have they don't talk to Palestinians, for one, try to understand what Palestinian aspirations are, what their concerns are, what their fears are. Palestinians are the objects to be discussed rather than subjects to discuss with them their future. And so what they know, or what they think they know, comes mainly from Israeli officials, primarily Israeli military officials, who of course have a very distorted view of who and what Palestinians are, and what they want and what they need. And so there is a kind of structural handicap that the administration is operating under in not hearing from Palestinians. That said, to your second question, I do think that the administration, that this time is somewhat different because the president and his team have invested a lot in this New Deal, even in terms of the theatrics of it. The big summit in Egypt and the pomp and circumstance surrounding the announcement, and of course his grandiose language about ending 3,000 years of war and making historic peace. I mean, so of course he's invested in this narrative. And so if it all comes crashing down, then it really looks bad for him, especially since he is auditioning quite openly for a Nobel Peace Prize. And so I do think he's a little bit more invested this time around than he was last spring. But the bar is very low because we've already seen that the kinds of violations that Israel does, daily killings, destruction, still restricting aid, those don't seem to bother the Trump team. And they don't see them as violations per se. And so it's just really a question of how much longer can that be sustained, right? Before things do collapse, before things do spiral out of control, and it all comes crashing down. And that's the part that we don't know. It's kind of like it's the old frog in the boiling pot. Right, it's on a slow boil, and so we won't know that it's dead until it's dead, and then it's too late.
Well, another pot with a frog in it is the West Bank, and I know we're running up out of time, but I told you, Khaled, I will get to this because it's very important. My I guess uninformed view, just looking from the outside in, is that while a ceasefire is being, managed, quote unquote, in Gaza, the radical settlers in the West Bank have taken advantage, and they seem to be ramping up. Can you talk a little bit about the violence in the West Bank and what that means? Like, what should we read into this?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just the settlers; it's also the Israeli army, and increasingly, the lines between Israeli soldiers and Israeli settlers is being erased. Many of the soldiers are themselves settlers in battalions stationed near their settlements, near Palestinian villages and towns. And many of them are sort of imbued with this supremacist ideology of religious Zionism, that God gave them this land, and therefore anything that they do to these interlopers, to these Palestinians, is justified. And so we see this rash of settler violence, settler terrorism against, even some Israeli officials have called them pogroms. Occasionally, you'll hear Israeli folks in the security establishment even use the word terrorism to describe them, because they are quite brazen. But what really fuels this is a kind of culture of impunity. When things get out of hand, you see condemnations like we have from the Israeli president over the past day or so, and others, and even some arrests. In rare instances, there are arrests of some of these settlers, but they are almost never convicted, and they certainly don't go to jail. In fact, we've seen videos of Israeli settlers literally murdering people on camera, and and the evidence is there. There are plenty of eyewitnesses, but the video evidence is there, and they are still roaming free. They haven't even, maybe they're called in for questioning by Israeli authorities, but then they're simply released. This culture of impunity has fueled this kind of explosion in settler terrorism against Palestinians. But it's part of a broader context in the West Bank that is largely invisible to most people because of the horrors happening in Gaza. That is kind of sucking all of the attention, and rightly so. Of course, it is quite horrific. But what is happening in the West Bank is also unprecedented. We've seen the Israeli army go in the northern West Bank. We've seen forced displacements for the first time since 1967. 40,000 Palestinians have been expelled from their homes, and mainly in refugee camps in the northern part of the West Bank. We're seeing the tactics used in Gaza being imported into the West Bank. Destruction of power lines, destruction of roads and basic infrastructure, raids on hospitals, in addition to the forced displacement. And so the Palestinians in the West Bank are under an enormous amount of pressure. And in the meantime, the Palestinian Authority, which is limited in its ability to, it doesn't actually, one of the greatest flaws of the Oslo process is there are all these mechanisms in place to protect Israelis from Palestinians. There's a whole security coordination mechanism between Palestinian security forces and the Israeli army. But there's actually literally nobody whose job it is to protect Palestinians from Israelis, whether it's settlers or the army. Palestinians can police themselves, but if an Israeli settler comes into a Palestinian town and goes on a shooting spree, Palestinian police do not have the right to arrest them. They will simply have to wait for Israeli soldiers to show up, or they might be able to detain them and hand them over, but they cannot detain them extensively, and they certainly couldn't shoot them in a life and death sort of situation. Right. So the situation is quite dire in the West Bank overall.
And now I know in recent times, the Trump administration officials, and I think including Trump, but I know for sure Rubio has said that he does not want to see a West Bank annexation. But yet there are Republicans and there are people in Trump's cabinet who have been very vocal about changing changing the name to Judea and Samaria. You have a ton of high-level donors to the Republican Party who also give to Israeli settlements. So you have a political incentive to sort of turn a blind eye to what's happening. Do you have any confidence at all? I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, that the Trump administration is going to does have a limit to what it's going to ignore before things get out of hand, and maybe they might slap some more sanctions on, or what is your level of confidence that Trump administration would actually say, hello, we helped you out in Gaza, we've let you do a lot, but we're not allowing this?
Excuse me. No, unfortunately, no. I do not anticipate the Trump administration sanctioning Israeli settlers. I mean, that was one of the very first things Trump did upon taking office, was to lift the meager handful of sanctions that the Biden administration had leveled against particularly egregious settlers that had murdered people, and as Khalid mentioned, settlers on camera murdering Palestinians and facing zero consequences. I think the only way we get anywhere is through public pressure and really speaking to the power of the America First movement to point out the incompatibility between how can we have an America First foreign policy if there's a huge asterisk for Israel. I think that we're seeing this increasingly, and it's tearing apart institutions like the Heritage Foundation. I mean, this is very front and center.
Yep.
In particular, as we're gearing up for the midterms, seeing candidates, mostly Democratic candidates so far, saying that they won't take AIPAC money, although there have been some AIPAC still channeling money to, through sort of shady backdoor channels. But, increasingly the toxicity of Israel's brand in the United States, I think has happened a lot more quickly than I think a lot of people who've worked on this issue for many, many years. They've been surprised at that swiftness. At the same time, my big concern at the moment is that there is this narrative that there's a ceasefire, such as it is, and that all of the pressure that had been building in over the summer, as just this narrative that Israel's apologists had maintained, this idea that it is somehow justified for Israel to murder scores of innocent people if they're going after one so-called terrorist. It became increasingly hard to maintain that justification when they were literally starving babies to death and not allowing in any food, infant formula, anything. And so the pressure had been building, and then we get this 20-point plan and the so-called ceasefire. And so now I do think we're going to return to a situation like we've seen for years in the West Bank, where it's just kind of a slow burn, and Israel will keep testing and pushing a little further and seeing what it can get away with, that frog in the boiling pot metaphor that Khalid used. They're going to probably continue to do that in Gaza, escalating little by little, seeing how much more violence they can mete out, and similarly in the West Bank. But I do think that it's going to be very hard to go back to where we were before. And this is part of why you do see efforts, things like Larry Ellison and the cadre of billionaires in the UAE buying TikTok to censor pro-Palestinian messaging that we know had gone a really long way in influencing how mostly young Americans, but a lot of Americans, their views of what was happening, just their awareness of what was happening. I do think that the conclusion has been that because Israel has lost the narrative, they're now just going to try to censor the narrative and not allow this information to get out. And to the extent that that information is getting out, it'll be framed as sort of this acceptable level of violence in contrast to sort of the all-out Holocaust of the past 2 years in Gaza. Again, I think it is imperative for the rest of the world to continue to build on this pressure, to escalate the pressure. And as Americans, we have just such a huge responsibility. And in particular, those who voted for Trump or who want this sort of America First foreign policy, to insist that they mean that you cannot continue to provide billions and billions of dollars for a country that so directly undermines U.S. interests at every turn. How like that hypocrisy that is part of what people tend to like about Trump, that he says it like it is. He's not ideological. He doesn't get to campaign on that and then now completely abandon it when it comes to Israel. So just very much hope that people will continue to pay attention to what's happening. And I mean, unfortunately, I do think that the scale of the impunity, as Khaled was saying, this violence that Israeli settlers have been allowed to conduct, I imagine there may be some Israeli leaders who are eager to shift the narrative that are having a hard time with doing so because of just the scale of the horror that we're seeing, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank.
Well, I think the key word is pressure. And if we can do our little part by keep talking about it, you guys I'm so happy to be working with you, because I know that you're speaking truth to power every single day and going on podcasts, going on the news, writing, getting published in places. And social media is still the best way to get this information out there and keep that pressure on and keep showing the awful imagery, but also like highlighting the hypocrisies that are evident in the whole situation. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and I hope to have you on again. We'll keep talking about this as much as we can.
Thanks a lot, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for everything you've been doing to draw attention to this.